Vroom vroom, and welcome to Dear Watchers, an omniversal comic book podcast where we do a deep dive into the multiverse.
We are traveling with you on our motorcycles through the stories and the worlds that make up an omniverse of fictional realities we all love. And with you during this word burger today, a phrase that I'm excited to talk about that shows up in our universe, are me, Imperita Guido.
And me, the Rob Warrior.
I thought you'd
That was
just
the
go
first-
for Mad Rob.
Oh no, the Rob Warrior, of course. That was the very first thing when we said we were discussing this universe. I was like, I'm going to be the Rob Warrior. I got it.
I was torn between Gidiosa and Imperator
Oh my god,
Guido.
Gidiosa is much better. Oh, you should,
Then I sound like a He-Man villain.
That too, yes. Well, before we begin our trip on this highway to hell today, Australian band, by the way. Oh, look at that. That matches with this universe. What's new in our little section of the multiverse, Guido?
We finished X-Men 97 like the rest of the world did also. And no spoilers. We won't be talking about it today. One day we'll talk about it, but it was great. So go watch it.
You're still recovering.
Yeah, I watched it twice immediately. I'm sure I'll watch it all again and again and again, and that's really exciting. So that's fun. Also, this week,
I was going to say, you're also recovering from the price of X-Men books and how they have jumped in value since everyone is now an X-Men fan.
Don't remind me, but yes, luckily we have a home we can mortgage. So we also submitted our pro applications for New York Comic Con. Very exciting. My favorite time of the year. And coming up this October, we'll be, of course, at New York Comic Con and hope to see some of our listeners and friends and fellow podcasters and creators that we've had on the show all there in New York City.
I'm staring at my plush pizza rat right now. Is in the very room I'm sitting up on a high shelf because that's the one thing that the dog really seems to want to devour, but he can't. That's my toy.
Well, this year they had a theme of like bodega. I don't know if you've seen their marketing. It's fun, actually. All the stuff is bodega. So they go for very New York iconic things. And today's episode is, speaking of iconic, both iconic and timely. We have so rarely had an immediate tie-in, but because our schedule went to every 2 weeks and because we're busy people, but this one is really fresh and we're excited. But just so you know, before we even get into our topic, we are not spoiling anything. We have not seen the Furiosa movie. So if you are listening or thinking of listening to the rest of this episode, don't worry. We have no spoilers for anything that is out in the Mad Max universe this year, 2024. We're going to be looking back at what got us here.
We were not at Cannes. I think that would be the only way to have seen the movie as of this recording, or to have been there, which we were not. But if you are joining us for the first time, we have 3 parts of our journey through the multiverse today: origins of the story, exploring multiversity, and pondering possibilities. So thanks for jumping in your car and coming along.
And remember, leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening, and find us on social media at Dear Watchers.
And with that, dear watchers, welcome to episode 134, and let's check out what's happening in the Omniverse with our travels to today's alternate universe. Today we put the pedal to the metal to answer the question, what if Furiosa of Mad Max barely appeared in a comic of her own name, but remained the best character ever?
She is. It's true. As is this question. Yeah, this is a weird one. So we'll call it Earth MM. It's Earth Mad Max. So unusually for us, this is probably a canonical story. It's not an alternate universe, but it is the only comic book installation of this story. So we decided to cover it. We decided it fits into the Dear Watchers platform. We'll explore a little bit about the Prime continuity and if it fits in. And of course, it'll be determined for sure if it's canonical after the forthcoming movie release of Furiosa, which is due out in just a few days from this episode's release here in May 2024. So we are going to get into, again, the universe up until Furiosa, nothing about the movie Furiosa, but we're going to be talking prime canon and what is prime canon in the Mad Max universe.
And speaking of the Mad Max universe, Guido, what is your background with this post-apocalyptic, sometimes almost post-apocalyptic, definitely apocalyptic universe?
This is a story I like. I don't even know how much you know about this story, but I came to Mad Max in my probably late 20s. So as a child, I had seen Beyond Thunderdome and really couldn't make sense of it at all.
The most kid-friendly movie, I guess. And there's a little kid in it too, right? So yeah.
But it had Tina Turner, so the most gay-friendly movie also.
That's also true.
And so I used to watch that, but it didn't really stick with me, and I don't know that I even saw the first two, really. And then I don't actually remember what compelled me, but I remember at some point in my late 20s being finally willing to visit this world and think like, okay, people like this world. I hate cars. I don't tend to love post-apocalyptic stories. I don't like Mel Gibson. Like, there was not a lot going for it for me, but I watched it and was amazed. I completely fell in love with it. I watched the first 3 movies, and the first 2, I couldn't believe how much I found that I liked. I liked how, well, we'll talk more about this, I think, a bit, but just what got me then was how political and social they were, how much commentary there was in them. I had no idea that that was going to be true. And so I then considered myself a big fan and loved the 3 movies. We saw Furiosa when it came out, Fury Road when it came out in the theaters. Fury Road. We saw Fury Road when it came out in the theaters. Utterly obsessed. I will say more when we talk about it, but it has lived in my top 5 movies of all time. It will probably forever live there. I absolutely love it. We saw it multiple times in the theaters. And from that, I read the comic books. I did not play the video game, which we will talk about today, but I read the oral history of Fury Road. I'm excited for the forthcoming oral history of the entire franchise. So I'm a big fan of Mad Max at this point, and it was a late arrival, I'd say. What about you with Mad Max? Because you're a bit younger, so you might not have been in the Beyond Thunderdome craze that I was.
No, I wasn't. And yeah, that is probably the movie that a lot of kids got into and had the big theme song as well. But no,
I think good theme song.
Yeah. I think my parents liked the movie, or my dad liked the movie. So at some point, I was given the DVD of the first film when I was in high school, and I didn't buy it myself. So they must have like bought it for me and thought like, oh, this is the kind of movie that Rob would like. And I watched the original movie a few times and watched Road Warrior. I don't think I actually saw Beyond Thunderdome until years later. It was never something that I loved until I think I saw Fury Road like you, and then kind of went back and then really liked the other ones, because the first 2 movies especially are such a like this beige brown palette, which of course is both very Australia and also very apocalyptic. But I think there was something about that look. It was like, oh, I wasn't really gravitating towards that. I wanted something maybe more colorful or more like black and white. But then, yeah, now it's definitely a franchise that I really love. And you and I have rewatched some of those earlier movies as well. And they work so well as a cohesive whole, which we'll talk more about right now.
Yeah. And there's a muffler going by that's probably coming through on our microphone. So it's like we're living in the Mad Max universe.
That's true. That's true.
And you never read the comics. So
no.
There's not a lot to consume in the Mad Max universe, which we will talk about, but you've only consumed the movies.
Correct.
Prior to this episode.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
So yeah, let's fuel up our car with some guzzoline and head out into Origins of the Story.
right now on this very show, you're going to get the answer to all your questions. Our amazing story begins a few years ago.
So let's do some background on Mad Max as a franchise for our origin. What's included in that? What stories and mediums have been a part of this post-apocalyptic wasteland? And figure out what prime canon is. Take us away.
Okay, so mastermind George Miller was an Australian medical doctor. I forgot this until I was doing research, that he's actually Dr. George Miller. And he had actually seen many horrible injuries from car crashes, and this would play a role in formulating this idea. And he was in residency at a Sydney hospital, and he met this amateur filmmaker named Byron Kennedy. And they created an award-winning short film together. And then 8 years later, with the screenwriter James McCausland, I probably butchered that name, they made the original Mad Max film, which they actually described as a silent movie with sound, which I love. And especially if you've seen that movie, or even Fury Road, you can kind of think,
any of them. I saw articles about perfect. Furiosa that, like, I think Anya Taylor-Joy has 30 lines or something like that. I love it.
Well, that first movie only cost about $300,000 to $400,000, and it actually grossed over $100 million. So huge success. It was followed by Mad Max 2, which was released as The Road Warrior in the US, because, you know, here it's like the metric system. We have to do our own thing.
Well, I couldn't believe when we were learning about this franchise to learn that they actually redubbed so that he wouldn't have an Australian accent. That was
the original was redubbed at one point with an American accent, and then obviously Mel Gibson wasn't a star yet. But then Mad Max 2 Road Warrior was released in the US, and that actually outperformed the original in the United States, in part because of the new rental market was out. Huge, big rental. But then producer and co-creator Kennedy died in a helicopter crash in 1983. Miller was actually reluctant to continue the series, but did decide to continue on with Beyond Thunderdome. He actually co-directed that movie due to his very busy schedule at the time. And this film had a bigger...
film feels like two movies.
Yeah, it kind of feels together. Like two movies. Yeah, and the other guy worked on like mini-series, so I don't know if he had a lot of feature experience. Yeah, it's kind of a mismatch, and it had a much bigger budget, but also a much lower box office. It did give us, of course, Tina Turner in one of her iconic looks, and the song
and We Don't Need Another Hero.
Including sexy sax man on sax and in the music video as well. And then Miller came up with the idea of Fury Road in 1987, but it was in development hell for years. He continued to develop with designs and storyboards and working on the script. And then he's so all over the place. So he directed The Witches of Eastwick. He made Babe Pig in the City. And then he
of course, famously developed Justice League for many years.
Yeah, Justice League, yeah. And then one of his other movies, which is very un-Mad Max-like, was Happy Feet. Huge hit in 2005. So he actually decided he probably had a lot of cachet in Hollywood at the time.
I think in the oral history, I think it's actually, if memory serves in the oral history, I think it's explicit. I think he made a deal to get Fury Road made because of the Happy Feet success or something. Like there was something, I think, really directly as a result of that.
So yeah, that movie, huge success, and then he decided to revisit Fury Road. It was shot in 2012, but not released until 2015. Obviously, lots of post-production on that movie, if you've seen it. And despite a budget of $150 to $180 million, which is a lot more than the $300,000 of the original movie, it was a huge critical and commercial success, made almost $400 million, won 6 out of its 10 Oscar nominations, was nominated for Best Picture, and that's actually a record for Australian films, and it was on many, of course, best of the decades lists, some best of the all-time lists, like your own list, Guido. And that next film, Furiosa, comes out next week as of this recording. This week. Still directed by George Miller, co-written by Nico Lathoras, who co-wrote Fury Road and today's comic. And that person actually appeared as an actor way back in the original Mad Max film. So this is very much a family business of people who come and go throughout this franchise.
Yeah, and oddly, although perhaps because it is such a tightly controlled IP, and I am sure and excited to learn from the forthcoming history book more about the ownership and how he's split that and how he's made deals, because for such a world, there is so little in this world. For a movie that has had so much success, even if you assume like, okay, Beyond Thunderdome maybe sort of killed the franchise a little, post Fury Road, you'd think you'd just be seeing Mad Max things everywhere, but you don't. And so in fact, the rest of the world of Mad Max is told only through a few things. First, there are 3 novelizations of the first 3 movies. We have not read them. Don't worry, they're now on my eBay watch list. And that's it in terms of the first 3 movies. Video games, there have been a good number of fits and starts. There's a famously canceled VHS game that was supposed to be really strange from the 1980s. There was a 1990 NES game, really critically panned. No plot, no story, very little tying it to Mad Max. There is a 1992 Genesis game called Outlander, which was developed as a Mad Max Road Warrior game, but they lost the license, so they just rebranded it. And then there's some canceled games in between, including some Miller himself is working on. It's not until 2015 that Avalanche Studios and Warner Brothers Interactive released Mad Max, which is the most ambitious of the video games, pretty well received and critically reviewed, has a story, was developed pre-Fury Road, though they ended up mapping Fury Road elements onto it to tie it in. So it is canonical and interestingly has a deep connection to the comic that we read today. So we're calling it canonical, and it is tied into our universe today for sure. But that is it. And then today's comics, which we'll get more into in our second segment, are the only comic book adaptations of this world at all.
Yeah. It's so strange because, of course, one thing I read over and over again was Batman 89 comic book adaptation growing up. And it just seemed like every movie, and we have like Free Jack, the comic adaptation.
Yeah, Darkman, the comic adaptation.
Darkman,
so
yeah.
many things.
And so it's just so and this feels like, of all things, it would 100% just be a great comic. Even if it came in after, of course, the original movie was like a surprise success. So even if it came years later in like the middle of the 80s, late 80s, you would go, of course, they would then eventually adapt it. So I don't know if that was Miller's choice or someone else. Yeah.
So, but for our first segment here, Origins of the Story, we'll focus on Prime Canon from those first 4 movies, but really talk about Fury Road, since that's what our comic book universe ties into today. So those movies are Mad Max from 1979, directed by George Miller, written by James McCausland and Miller with Byron Kennedy. Mad Max 2, aka Road Warrior from 1981, directed by Miller with written by Terry Hayes, George Miller, and Brian Hannant. And Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome from 85, directed by Miller and George Ogilvy, written by Terry Hayes and George Miller. Then we take a huge leap to Mad Max Fury Road, literally 30 years later, directed by George Miller, written by George Miller, Brendan McCarthy, and Nico Lathoris. So, okay, our listeners now know we both love Fury Road. It's one of my favorite movies ever. Let's talk about why. Who should start?
I think one of the things we said last night after rewatching the movie is that it just, for a 2-hour movie, it goes by so quickly. And I think one of the great things about it is it doesn't feel the need to follow any kind of Hollywood playbook in terms of plotting. It's just suddenly the movie starts. It doesn't give you the backstory. It's about probably like 20 or 30 minutes until you even come up for air. And then
it does start and barely stop. Yes.
Yeah, and then you get like nice like a lull. It's almost like a concert, I'm thinking, where like you want to start with the songs that really grip you, but then if you're going at that speed the entire time, you'd kind of zone out. So then you need the ballad in the middle, and then you kind of need to end with another big one again.
Yeah, that's a really good comparison, actually, as a concert pacing, because it does, in my mind, it starts and like you're just adrenalized the whole time. But then I was reminded, like, oh no, there are beats, but they hit at unusual times. It doesn't build in an arc like a traditional narrative does. Yeah. So I think the pacing is a huge part of it. I think for me, it's so many things. It's the pacing, it's the visuals, it's the soundtrack is just extraordinary. But the thing that makes it an obvious choice for us to be talking about on this show, and the reason that we have this show, and I've talked a lot about over our 134 episodes, is the world building.
Yeah.
I think it is just stunning to me that this movie is so ambitious, has so much depth, and yet trusts the audience completely, because there is almost nothing gets explained. I can't even think, I don't think I would call any of the lines exposition in that movie. No one is explaining anything to anyone, and yet it still works. You completely, you don't need to know how Immortan Joe rose to power, although we learn it in the comics, which we'll talk about. You don't need to know how the Citadel functions. You don't need to know why the War Boys spray their faces with silver and are obsessed with cars. Like, you get it. You just get it all. You don't need to know why Immortan Joe's skin is all bubbly and why his children are all mutated. Like, none of it matters, and yet it's all so important. And clearly Miller, we know, has a Bible of this world.
Yeah.
He has the world mapped out, and it's so incredible to me that each aspect of it, when you meet the Volvolini, when you have the wives be like the reveal that what Furiosa is doing, when you have like the bullet farmers versus the gas hogs and Gas City, like it's just, the whole world is so sketched out and deep, and yet not explained to you at all. And I love that.
Yeah, you know, the thing I thought that it actually reminded me of in this rewatch is Star Wars in some ways. And I think like Lucas was also someone who like really fleshed out, like had this big like Bible. But then it's making me think like Star Wars, the first one just starts and it's like, it's episode 4. And like, wait, what's happened before this? And like, here's Princess Leia, and she's a senator's daughter, but we never meet the senator, and all this. And also Star Wars, like this, is just like full of these characters who have names, who fans now love, but are never named in the movie. Like Salacious Crumb, like Jabba the Hutt's little like court jester. Like people know that name, but nobody ever calls him that in the movie. It's just like in the credits. Yeah,
because like there's the guitar guy. What's his name? Doof, and he
the
doesn't have a
Doof
name
Warrior, and everyone like if you know this movie, you know the Doof Warrior. No one knows that he never call him that. And so it's like a similar thing where it's like is obsessed. You can tell that those creators, Miller and Lucas, like they knew exactly who every single person was gonna be in this, and every single person has a backstory, and now the fans have kind of absorbed it, but it somehow gets through to you because they know it. It's like when an actor knows their character's backstory, even if that doesn't come out, it's never mentioned in the exposition, but it somehow makes their performance so much better because they know their own backstory. And it's the same thing in the writing and direction here.
Well, and in that way, too, it's interesting. It's funny you mentioned Star Wars starting with episode 4, which I think was a retcon, right? I don't think it's on,
I believe, the original.
I don't know
the title was added later, but anyway.
Yeah, I don't think it was like, here, watch part 4 of this new movie. But in this is like it's almost an early requel, using the language of Scream 7, because it's canonical. It's supposed to have followed the Max we know, but that's not clear nor necessary. And that's really cool and really well done. Like, I remember even when seeing this, not being totally sure, like, is that supposed to be the Max we know? He's flashing back to his daughter getting killed, but he's also flashing back to this other girl getting killed, which relates to the comic we're about to read. Like, so I wasn't clear in 2015 if it was supposed to be the Max Rockatansky, and it is. Since then, George Miller has said, yes, this is one world, this is one character. But even that idea is very cool, and it's a little bit like other movies, but I thought of it because of the Star Wars starting in part 4. Like this one, you're not really clear where you're starting in the story. Even you and I were talking about where does this fall, how much time has passed, and you don't really know, nor do you really need to know, but it's fun to think about.
Well,
that's the
I would
depth
say
of
almost everything in the Mad Max series are requels of themselves. Like Road Warrior is very much almost a requel of the original Mad Max in many ways, because now it's like, we're fighting another group of evil biker road people. And then even when you think back to the original film and this film, one of the really cool things is that the main villain in both films are played by the same actor. The same actor plays Immortan Joe in Fury Road and Toe Cutter in the first film. So it's almost like it's a requel, and you're almost thinking in your head, wait, could Immortan Joe be Toe Cutter? No, Toe Cutter like explodes. So no, it's like he can't be the same person. But it works in that way where it's like, almost taking that original concept. It's like almost what if Toe Cutter became like a cult leader, like 20
I even
years
told
later
you today that the name Furiosa says her mother is, Concanon, is in the original script, so not even used in the movie, but in Miller's original script for Mad Max, it's one of the rookie cops involved in the first movie. So, like, again, the architecture of this world is just so clearly laid out in, if not his mind, then probably on paper somewhere, and it makes it pay off enormously. Now, let's get into Furiosa a little, since she's the reason we took this journey today, even though, we'll get into the comics, and obviously our listeners learned the title of this episode, so she's not a huge part of the comics. She is a huge part of the movie, though. And I think that is the coolest thing. I think this movie, I remember feeling this, seeing it for the first time and seeing it again for, I don't know, the 6th time last night, reminded me the same feeling. This movie almost feels like a Trojan horse. It feels like one of those movies where you're thinking you're going in watching a Mad Max movie and you're not. You're watching a Furiosa movie for sure. She is the protagonist of this movie.
Yeah, it's almost reminding me of what they did with the He-Man animated series on Netflix too, where it's like, it's Masters of the Universe, it's He-Man, and then the first season is actually like a Teela story. And it's had that similar thing here. And of course, Max plays such a big part, but I think what Miller does so smartly is really give Furiosa the emotional beats in the story.
And the character development. Like Max is sort of always Max. He cares and he does things, but he wants to be alone. Like he doesn't change. And even in this movie, he doesn't change. He's always willing to protect the helpless, but he's always resistant because he needs to first protect himself. And then he's always going to end up on his own. So like, there's no change for him in this, but Furiosa is the one who, well, the conflict of the movie, if you will, is created by her having a change of heart. And then you slowly are learning what that means to her and why and what she's trying to do. And she's like Max in some ways. She doesn't want to take him on, but then learns to accept having an able. So she has more of the arc for sure.
Well, what's interesting though is, and we'll get into this in a moment when we talk about the comic, so much of her arc actually occurs in the comic more, I almost would say, than in this movie.
Yeah, well, and I mean, that's what's so interesting here is, and this will be a good segue into our next segment, I think, is Miller had all of these ideas laid out for so many years that it's hard to tell what came first and what didn't, right? Like he's not really even retconning. Like he had Furiosa as a movie in development while working on Fury Road. And so the comics like are not, they're not being done after the movie, even though they're coming out with the movie. It's so hard to say, like, he just knows everything that happened to Furiosa. So in the movie, we know these little bits, or we're like hinted at these little bits, but we don't have them fully fleshed out. Something like the comic can give us a little bit more, and then something like the movie coming out this week can give us even more, and none of it feels like it's been shoehorned in. And I'm not trying to like join the criticizing Marvel bandwagon ever, because I love it, but you can tell when Marvel,
yes,
Kevin Feige always talks about all those connections what happens is they just ask the writers and directors to like leave a bunch of doors open, and then they'll sort of go back in them and figure out what to do with it. And that is not what Miller is doing. Like, Miller has mapped this out. He is not just picking up loose threads. It's like, no, he knows everything about these characters.
Yeah. My weird random tangent, but one of my favorite all-time Hollywood stories is with like the late Halloween franchise, where like it completely went off the rails and there's an evil cult, and at the end of, I think it's Halloween 5, like a man all in black, Michael Myers has been arrested, and a man all in black unlocks the jail and lets Michael Myers out. And someone asked the director, so who is that man in black? And the director said, that's for the director of movie 6 to figure out. So it's like...
Exactly. See, that's the Marvel way, but the Miller way is not that. And I'm sure he's making changes, of course, but like, no, he has a series Bible on these folks. And I think that's a good point for us to get in more info about these characters.
Okay, we are moving now into exploring multiversity.
I am your guide through these vast new realities. Follow me and ponder the question, what if?
So this week we are asking the question, what if Furiosa of Mad Max barely appeared in the comic of her own name? And that comic is actually a comic book series of 4 comics called Mad Max Fury Road. And the individual issues we're discussing are Nux and Immortan Joe #1, Furiosa #1, and Max #1 and #2 from July to October 2015, all from DC Comics. We also read The War Rig, which is a short story exclusive to the collected edition of the above issues, which I believe you said, Guido, has made this collected edition quite the collectible.
Well, like a lot of licensed comics, when the license is lost, these things will never be reprinted. So these are not available digitally. They're not available in any new collected editions. So yeah, the out-of-print collected edition is astronomical right now. Obviously, the movie's hot, so I'm not surprised. But these are hard to track down. I hope people have them. The floppies are not super expensive. They obviously have increased in value with hype for the movie, but they are pretty available. So real quick on the credits, and there are a good number of credits. There's one key person here, and we'll focus in on him in a moment. But overall, writers are credited to George Miller and Nico Lathoris, and that's because of the story and the story Bible that they're pulling from in the original. And then it's written primarily by Mark Sexton. More on him in a moment. Mark also does a lot of the pencils and art. The Max issues he does solo, but on the Nux and Immortan Joe, Furiosa, and War Rig issues, he has a lot of help from Leandro Fernandez, Riccardo Bertielli, Andrea Muti, Tristan Jones, Simon Kurjansky, and Peter Pound. Inkers, Mark is also credited, but has some help from those same folks: Leandro Fernandez, Riccardo Bertielli, Andrea Muti, Tristan Jones, Simon Kurjansky, and colors by Michael Spicer. Letters by Clem Robbins, with letters by Laverne Kanzersky on the War Rig single story. And edited by Alex Antone. The collection is edited by Jeb Woodward. So Nico Lathoris, I don't even think probably was so involved in the comics. He only has written Fury Road and Furiosa, and as you mentioned, is an actor. Or did you mention he's an actor? I don't know.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But here, Mark Sexton, who is a storyboard artist who worked with Miller, he is the one who wrote this comic. And he has a great intro giving sort of the genesis of how Furiosa, being in development for 20 years, he worked on a lot of the storyboarding that was done early in its genesis, way pre-production. He then worked on Happy Feet and did storyboards for that. He storyboards for Marvel. He did Love and Thunder, Ant-Man and Wasp, Falcon and Winter Soldier, a lot of big stuff that Mark Sexton's doing. But here he was able to take the the development, the story, the Bible from Miller and Lathoris, and turn it into these 4 issues. So
I just want
we're not
to
going
share. Oh, I just wanted to share one thing from his introduction, which he says. So I went into a magnificent old Art Deco theater and was directed up to the big room in the center of the building that George used as his office. And I just love that George Miller's office is in the middle of an Art Deco movie theater, which just feels
all the
very
stories
Mad Max
though
to
too
you.
of the storyboards. I mean, the storyboarding is what they did for probably I want to say a decade, and you should read it
like
in that oral history. Like in that office, they do just the walls. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of storyboards. Really cool way, and it speaks to why the movie is so visually striking and stunning and unique. And so he's also deep in the story, Mark Sexton. So it's very cool that he did this. Now, we won't really give too much of a summary. Essentially, these are almost origin comics, if you will. So you get Nux's origin really briefly at the start of that issue. You get Immortan Joe's origin, which is a little more fleshed out of who he is.
He probably gets the biggest origin story.
He gets the biggest origin story. Agreed. Furiosa's issue, you actually don't get her origin. We'll focus on that in a moment. It's about her meeting the wives or the breeders and then making the decision to take them away, which of course then the movie, she's already taken them. You just don't realize it at first. And then Max number 1 and 2 is telling what Max's story is happening parallel perhaps to the other comics prior, obviously, to Fury Road, because they haven't kidnapped him yet. So it's essentially a rescue story. He's fighting a little bit of a different, he's fighting those people that Furiosa makes the deal with on the hill who have all the spiky cars.
The buzzards. Yeah, with all the spiky
buzzards,
cars, yeah.
And then, but he meets Hope and Glory, a mother and daughter who he has to save the daughter, and it brings up his own past with his wife and child being killed. They end up getting killed in the comic, and then that leads us to where Max is at the start of Fury Road. One interesting note before we dive into the Furiosa issue is that is also the plot of the 2015 video game. So clearly Miller at some point shares this part of Max's story, this fact that he met these people and this arc. And again, that's what makes all of this canon and none of it an alternate universe, because it's all coming back to that singular series Bible.
Yeah, and in the video game, I believe it was going to be one of Immortan Joe's sons, who you don't really see in the movie.
Yeah, and that was mapped on the
villain.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Scrotus or something, some weird name. I think his name is Scrotus. I think it actually is Scrotus.
And I was going to say, too, there's also like the classic portmanteau kind of framing device here also of an older man who's like a storyteller. You mentioned Wordburger at the beginning. History man, yeah, who's telling the story to a bunch of kids. It actually reminded me, Guido, of one of your another movie in your all-time top 5, which is Cloud Atlas. Doesn't Cloud Atlas use a very similar structure there as well with...
one of the timelines in the future, he's recounting the stories of the past.
And a bunch of tattoos, I want to say. It's a very similar design.
That's true.
Maybe they shared minds there. And the Wachowskis are kind of a similar mindset of George Miller, where it's a very deep dive into a universe.
And that's why I love them, right? They're all these multi-layered stories that trust the audience, that are super ambitious, that have a lot of mythology to them. So for sure, there's connections there. And the history men are really interesting. And yeah, the Wordburger is what he calls like the narration, basically. He's like, okay, time for a Wordburger. And it's so funny. It's one of those great alternate universe devices where it's like, okay, that is totally new and original to Miller, and he invented it, or Sexton in this case, but makes total sense, like, and gives me a sense of how language changed and developed.
It's like guzzoline too, which is what they call gasoline. Totally. Exactly. And it's just like a couple letters difference, but you instantly takes you to a different place.
Well, and it gives you like the idea of like guzzling as, consuming. And we do see like the War Boys like drink the gasoline and spit it out. And so like that one invention gives you so much depth to the world. And that's what's so cool. Anyway, I'll stop fanboying now that we're on the comic, because the comic is only okay. beautiful art, but the Furiosa
Beautiful
comic
art. Great
is
art.
only okay because it's just like, it's like a drop in the bucket of the story we all want. So what did you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting because, as we said, like Immortan Joe, you kind of get his whole, it's abbreviated still, but you kind of get his whole origin story of he's like a military person before the fall and then how he takes over the Citadel. But yeah, Furiosa is actually just really feels like a couple of days before the events of Fury Road, and you kind of just see her kind of coming to terms with making the decision to save the wives.
It's more time than that because there's the one who's pregnant and loses the pregnancy, and then the one who's pregnant in the movie is not yet pregnant when Furiosa gets assigned. So we know months have passed, but we don't see those months, like, because it's irrelevant. Because ultimately, in the story, I guess we will summarize it briefly since it's so hard to find for people, this story. What's happening in this story is the things we find out that are in addition to Fury Road are we find out that Immortan Joe's other sons all have some sort of mutation, and he's trying to have a son that doesn't. And that's why he creates that environment that they're not wives, but that the women live in, is so that he can try to have a non-mutated healthy pregnancy. And ultimately they have their teacher, Miss Giddy, who you do meet in the movie, and it's fun to see more of her here when she gets assigned and stuff. And then, but they need someone to take care of the women and sort of keep them in check, but also keep the other men away from the women, because Immortan Joe doesn't want anyone touching them, so that there's more of a chance they'll have a pregnancy with him. That's where the explanation for the chastity belts that we see in the movie comes in. So Furiosa is assigned to them, and then slowly we see that they're making this connection over the possibility of escape and what it means to walk away and what it means to be treated as a thing, and there's little bits of that in there. So it's just giving us that little sense of her decision to take them, but yeah, nothing else with her life, her backstory, nothing with the Vulvolini, the Green Place, nothing.
But I think so much of that speaks to the fact that now that we're going to have a movie that is a prequel of her,
exactly,
that he didn't want to give that away in the comic. He was like, oh, that's going to be a whole separate story. I'm just going to tell a little bit of her. That's why I was saying before, too, we actually see more of her character arc here in this comic than we do in the movie, because here in the arc, she kind of starts off saying like, well, you're all spoiled brats, basically, because you get all the water you want and you have clean air, and everyone else out there, yet you're still complaining that, like, you know, that you're captive of this horrible man. And then she kind of comes to realize, oh no, like, they are just like me, like none of us are free, and that's when she makes the decision. So you see more of that character arc for her here than you actually do in the film itself.
Yeah, I agree. That's true. And I think you're right. It does definitely feel like, and we know Furiosa was in development, was greenlit when Fury Road was such a huge success. Furiosa and apparently a sequel named Wasteland were both greenlit, and then Wasteland got pushed aside for Furiosa, and then I'm assuming COVID delayed things, so maybe we would have had a movie sooner than waiting 9 years. But I think it is clear from this that he has the whole of Furiosa's backstory, and he did not want to reveal any of it here. Because even, like, she doesn't, someone asks her why she doesn't have an arm in the comic, and she does not say, she doesn't refer back to it. She doesn't give, like, an origin of even why she starts working for Immortan Joe. Like, that's not in here. Like, none of it. Her, we know she gets taken, but we don't know, like, how she moves up in the ranks to become an Imperator. So...
Yeah, I think what I got a lot more out of actually the two Max issues than I got out of the Furiosa. And the Nux and Immortan Joe are kind of fun, just kind of backstory, the true origin stories. The Max one actually answers a lot more questions from Fury Road than the Furiosa one, because the Furiosa you can kind of put two and two together. But yeah, Max also has this stuff
takes you from the Thunderdome. It also takes you from Thunderdome into this, like, it's supposed to kind of be a bridge, and it refers to him leaving Thunderdome.
And there's
that he goes into another fighting arena.
Yeah, there's so many key elements in Fury Road with those subliminal or fantasy shots of a little girl who's not his daughter, and you're watching the movie going, I have no idea who this is, and it ultimately plays like an important plot point in saving his life. Even in Fury Road, you don't know who she is really until actually you read this comic. And so it's so interesting that they actually had this whole thing which plays a pretty significant role in the film and yet saved it for the comic. So I mean, again, it feels like these little tidbits, these little treasures that are in the movie that you're not supposed to even 100% understand. But what did you think about kind of getting some of that backstory, some of that motivation then from Max with the Glory and her mom?
Yeah, I agree. I love it. And I think, going back to your point about Furiosa, I think some of why that was like a 2-issue more fleshed out series is because I would imagine he didn't really have an intent to make that movie. Like, why make a movie of Max that takes place between Beyond Thunderdome and Fury Road? Like, that would not be a movie anyone needs to see. So I think but he already had that arc. Now, whether that was like a movie that was earlier in development or he came up with that idea during the video game development process over the 20 years he was developing games, who knows? But clearly he was like, oh, let me tell that story here. Whereas, yeah, the Furiosa, he's holding back the story clearly.
Yeah, and I think it's important to see where we start with Max in Fury Road, the film, because he is really down and out, and also really more of a loner than he even was before. Like, he really wants to just be by himself and doesn't care.
And he's hallucinating a little, and we don't know why. Like, he's having these flashbacks. Yeah.
And all that is actually brought up in the fact that despite the fact that he saved this little girl, moments after he saved her and her mother, they're both killed. And then he loses his car, and it really kind of puts him at the mindset and also kind of the physical restraints that he's in at the start of the movie. So very interesting that they saved that for a comic. I don't think I've ever seen that kind of storytelling before in movie to comics dumb.
No, and some of the synergy, I wonder if it came out of Warner Brothers owning obviously DC. That's why it's interesting that there's a license at play here that has this collection out of print, because Warner must not outright own these characters in these stories. Otherwise there'd be a lot more synergy, I think, of those stories. But I think when you look at the video game, comics, and movie together, all three are Warner and all three are Miller, and the synthesis and the synergy is so fascinating and so unique.
Well, it might be similar to James Bond, which Eon Productions owns, but MGM has the deal to release them, so they must have just that kind of thing where they don't actually own the property like Star Wars and Disney. But we'll see.
So before we move on to talk more about Furiosa, one thing to mention is the War Rig backup is great also. It's so fun. Again, I hate cars. Somehow I love this world and I hate cars. And I love this comic, but each chapter, each page, I should say, of this brief comic is a different part of the War Rig and how it got put on there. So you get like the one pager of the Volkswagen Bug that's like on top of it and the story of that part. So it's just such a cool concept. I loved that. I was shocked how much I loved that story. So let's talk more Furiosa though.
Yes. So we're coming to the end of the road, but before we do, let's ponder some possibilities.
Will the future you describe be averted, averted?
So, Guido, what are we talking about for our pondering possibilities?
Well, Furiosa is coming out this week, but we're not going to just predict that movie because our predictions will be null and void in 4 days. So there's a lot, though, to start here. I do want to talk a little bit about what we want to see in Furiosa and beyond, but I'm also want to return to this question of why isn't there more tie-in stuff? Well, we can't answer it, and we've speculated on the business stuff. But, like, what would be your ideal tie-ins? And then especially looking at comics, like what comic series from this world would you want to see, or do you think could support even an ongoing or a mini series or something like that? So do you want to start?
Yeah, I think in terms of which ones, well, I'll start with tie-ins. And in terms of like the tie-ins, I think what the movie, even in recasting Mel Gibson for Fury Road, showed that it doesn't need Max as a character, and I'm sure we'll see that in Furiosa to kind of take us through this world. And as you said, Furiosa is really the star of the movie. So I think in terms of tie-ins, I'd love to see other worlds that Max isn't a part of. I think,
but with people we've met, or you're just saying you want other things? Like,
I think both. I mean, I think the number chief one of the people who we've met, I would love to find a cover is the female warriors that we meet.
The Volvolini.
The Volvolini, yeah.
Oh yeah. No, they're my answer. I want a comic series of the Volvolini. I want a TV series of the Volvolini. I want
and not
everything.
Just, I think, I'm sure we'll see them in Furiosa, but not just probably even what's dealt with there. But I mean, like, again, like there's 20 years of other storylines in between. So it feels like the kind of thing that we could totally just see what they've been doing. And it was probably a much bigger group than we see in Fury Road as well. So we could have even more characters to play with.
Well, and even who each of them are. And, you know, in Fury Road, like, Max recognizes its bait. When they trap someone, what are they doing? Are they killing people? Mm-hmm. Are they like, they're obviously traveling around. The woman has the seeds. I also can't help, you're not going to know this reference, but our listeners, some of our listeners will. They are exactly, there's no way Jonathan Hickman wasn't inspired by them for horticulture. So I think I probably told you about them, but you weren't reading X-Men. Right after Powers' house, when Hickman's writing X-Men, he introduces horticulture, which is a group of evil old women that are like meant to be like the Golden Girls kind of, that are really sassy and sarcastic and like have like big guns and are like eco warriors. So they are the Volvolini without a doubt. And that makes me want a whole Volvolini comic book series too.
You know, one thing I'm thinking too is there's that great moment in Fury Road with, I think actually it's with the Volvolini, where they're seeing like a satellite fall and they're saying, well, that's what they used to show like TV shows on.
That's what shows used to come through on. Yeah.
So and it's almost making me wonder, because I think all of Mad Max world kind of exists within Australia. Are there other parts of the world that haven't been touched by the fall or in the same way? So I'd wonder if there's an interesting story to show where civilization is actually a bit more stable in that way. What do you think about something like that?
I imagine it's not the case, because if the world ran out of oil, I think every civilization would collapse.
Well, unless some rich place like that had oil like that I don't know, that was stockpiling it. I mean, they're still able to get oil out of the ground because they create gasoline in Fury Road. So there's still some way to make it.
Yes, but very limited. So no, I think all of civilization fell. But sure, we can definitely explore the globe. You're right, we haven't yet. And I don't know why Miller's made that decision to not. I guess he sticks with what he knows. Keeping it local. Keeping it local also just helps you sort of connect pieces. So I'm not sure why that is.
I think regardless of what other stories there is, I think the Toad is so key to me, and I'm making me think like there are similarities between this and other post-apocalyptic stories. Like I'm thinking especially The Last of Us. And I loved, like, The Last of Us was great television. I'm not really looking forward to it coming back on TV because it's not a pleasant watch.
Right, it's not fun. Yeah.
I did not look forward to like watching it every week when it's like, oh, now people we love that get killed, and like it's an hour-long meditation on like love and grief. It's like, but this is just fun. So it's I think like that is so key to the tone that he's able to strike. It's like we're able to even in the comic and in the movies, like little children get killed, and it is like characters that we have grown to like are killed, including in Fury Road, and yet somehow it doesn't feel dark and heavy like a Last of Us feels. And I think that's one of the reasons why I enjoy it so much.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that translates well into comics and could translate into any other tie-ins.
And would you, as a comic fan especially, would you want to see more comics, maybe not a movie spin-offs, but comic spin-offs and all that kind of thing?
Yes, as I just said, the Volvolini is what I'd like to see. But I think any of these characters can work in comics. I think even Max could work. I think because we only have a Prime canon in this universe, you probably wouldn't be able to do a Max story unless it tells little stories that occurred in between the movies we've already seen, such as the 2 issues that we read did. But otherwise, any of these other characters you could easily see in a comic series. You could even have a comic series that's like the origin of the Citadel. We still don't know, and perhaps in the Furiosa movie we will see how the Citadel comes to be. But also in Fury Road, right there, we've blown open the mythology because someone could give us the bullet farmers in a one-shot or 4-issue miniseries. Like, tell us how the bullet farm started. We can assume someone just hoarded all the bullets, but tell us more. That guy is crazy, and it's so interesting, and I love it. And then certainly when you go into Gastown and that guy with the metal nose, like, you just get so many interesting characters out of each of these segments that I think any of them could be in a comic. And I like that they protect the Prime canon, so I would expect any tie-ins or spin-offs or offshoots to continue to do the same. Interestingly, there's been no announcement of a comic to tie in with the Furiosa movie. Not even a one-shot, nothing, no special. I don't know if the movie does really well, if we'll quickly get an announcement for something like later this fall. Obviously, in 2015, they were releasing them parallel, so they weren't waiting for the hype. They were ready for it. So we'll see. I'll be curious if we get more. I'm so excited to see Furiosa in the next few days. And that's it.
Yeah, and let us know after you see it what your thoughts are, or maybe you've located this hard-to-find comic, and let us know your thoughts. But until then, that's a wrap, dear watchers. Thank you so much for listening.
I have been Imperator Egidio.
And I have been the Rob Warrior.
The reading list is in the show notes. You can follow us online, especially on Threads at Dear Watchers.
And leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. We'll be back soon with another trip through the multiverse.
In the meantime, keep pondering the possibilities.